Next up to Justin Trudeau's Canada and the alarming rise of medically assisted suicide there. In recent weeks, people around the world have been shocked by the case of Amir Farsood, a 54-year-old disabled man who has opted to go on the medical assistance in dying program, the MAID program in Canada, not because he's got a few months left to live or a few years left to live, but because he's been kicked out of his house, effectively. So to discuss this very alarming case, I caught up with Kevin Yuill. Kevin is a Spike contributor. He's a Canadian by birth, and he's the author of a great book, Assisted Suicide, the Liberal Humanist Case Against Legalisation. Here's what he had to say. So to kick things off, should we talk about this case in particular? How typical is it? Could you just tell us some of the details of this particular gentleman and the decision he's chosen to take?
Well, Mr. Farsood, who is officially suffered from a disability, and according to the change in the rules that happened a little ways back, he was allowed an assisted suicide or euthanasia, which is much more typically what people ask for in Canada. And his case came up, but it received a lot of publicity, which is interesting. It didn't even make a huge impact when it first came up. I mean, he is 55 years old, I believe, or 54. And he suffered from a disability that gave him chronic pain, but mostly what he suffered from was poverty. And what happened was his landlord gave him notice because he wants to sell the property in which Mr. Farsood shares a house. And this was so depressing and awful for Mr. Farsood that he thought he couldn't cope, and therefore he requested euthanasia. And the way that Canada works means that there's no obligation to exhaust every other possibility. So therefore, he was signed off by one GP who knew exactly what his situation was, and he was seeking another signature. Fortunately, however, because his case was publicized, there was a crowdfunding, and he received $60,000, which was enough for him to start out to resolve his problems. And it's interesting that $60,000 is approximately what is saved by each euthanasia. So basically, you can see that his problems were solved by $60,000, which would have, been the savings that would have been made by his euthanasia. But his is just one of many kind of cases. So there's another one, Michael Fraser, who did go through with it. He was 55 years old. He was unable to pay his rent or to get outside. He was disabled. And he chose euthanasia, and it was granted. So many people will say, "Oh, this is one or two horrific cases." But of course, if we were looking at capital punishment, we don't say, well, this is just one case of innocence, and we don't care that much. Mm-hmm. So it's this very blasé perspective on life that I think is happening in Canada and is being forwarded by the whole euthanasia agenda.
And could you tell us a bit more about what the Canadian law is, who qualifies, and how it ended up in the place that it has? How long have these laws been on the books, and how have they developed, I guess?
Well, it's a fairly recent development in many ways. There was a court case in British Columbia of a woman who suffered from MS, what we would call MS or ALS in Canada. And she went to court to try and force the government to award her euthanasia. The BC court agreed with her and said that the federal government, in order to comply with the Charter of Rights, the Canadian Charter of Rights, had to actually grant euthanasia. So the judge ordered Parliament to change the law, which is, there's a whole other discussion about that relationship. But the key thing is that happened in 2016, it was changed. The law was duly changed by the Trudeau government. And then the following year, you had a Quebec court who was faced with a situation where somebody whose death wasn't reasonably foreseeable, which was in the original stipulations, the safeguard, so to speak, was that death had to be reasonably foreseeable. Already that was pretty vague because it's sad to say all of our deaths are reasonably foreseeable. But they removed that phrase. This judge ordered Parliament to remove that phrase, and therefore there was what's called Track 2, which is people who have disabilities or conditions that cannot be alleviated and from which they feel that the suffering is intolerable. And that phase two, that track two rather, is how Mr. Farsood and Mr. Fraser were allowed assisted suicide. But finally, in March 2023, mental illness is being added. And that was also done through a bizarre criteria whereby a investigation was ordered, which is only reporting back in March. So already they have legalized it in essence, but they are delaying it so that they can study it. But of course, every bit of studying they've done has just simply underlined the need for euthanasia for mental illness. So Canada leads the world in terms of euthanasia. Within a few short years, it has expanded beyond all recognition. It's further ahead than the Netherlands or Belgium, where it has been legal for the past 20 years, in the sense that doctors don't have to actually give alternatives and can't deny euthanasia on the basis that their alternatives exist. So it's a very comprehensive and fairly frightening regime of euthanasia that is now in place.
And as you've written about for us, it's really is, if we don't want to, we don't have to call it the slippery slope, but it's something like it insofar as now, in what was it last year, 3.3% of deaths in Canada being accounted for by this particular program, and number kind of steadily climbing. And whilst people often dismiss that as a fallacy, it's hard to dismiss the idea that this hasn't spread beyond the bounds that were originally given for it. But I mean, Kevin, I just wanted to pick up on the title of your book, and the case that you make in your book is the liberal humanist case against assisted suicide, against this new form of euthanasia. I was wondering if you could just give us that case in a nutshell, if you like, given the fact that I think the opposition to assisted suicide is often associated with a kind of more conservative or often religious sort of opposition.
Yeah, I mean, my opposition is, first of all, atheistic. It's based on a couple of things. First of all, that it's not necessary to change the law. So there are a few cases whereby pain can't be alleviated, but these are very, very few. Even by Dignity in Dying's numbers that they present, about 1% of deaths they regard as being bad deaths. Mm-hmm. So there's no need to change the law. What it's driven by is a climate of fear. So they will present these terrible cases and make you fear that this is perhaps what you have in prospect if you don't back this legislation. So I think it's not terribly necessary. This is why the hospice movement opposes it in a big way, because they actually witness deaths. And as they say, the vast majority of them are peaceful. So that's, first of all, it's not necessary. But second of all, it's wrong, and I feel immoral, to encourage, let alone assist a suicide. I think that's the problem. We are rightly horrified when people gather at the bottom of a tall building and yell jump to somebody who's up at the top. We don't think that suicide is a good thing. And it's this principle of assisting a suicide. One of the interesting things that's come out of Canada very, very recently, in fact, in the last few days, is that the Minister of Justice, David Lametti, has admitted that this is all about suicide. And he's admitted that in fact, the laws actually allow people to kill themselves in a more genteel way. And what we're finding is that, for instance, there are more and more women who are coming forward for euthanasia. So it's increased. If we regard euthanasia as suicide, it's increased fairly dramatically across every country where it's legal, the suicide rates for women, which I think is a very, problematic development. But yes, my problem with assisted suicide is not on the individual cases. It's on changing the principle that we try to prevent suicide.
Just finally, Kevin, before we let you go, what are the prospects, do you think, for assisted suicide making it onto the books in the UK on British statute? It's a debate that hasn't flared up probably for a couple of years, given that there's been a lot of other things to argue about in recent years in British politics. But what are the prospects, do you think, for these kinds of laws making their ways into the British law?
Well, I think there are a couple of interesting things that are happening at the moment. First of all, there's an attempt to change the law in Scotland, and it's very difficult to see how that's going to go. It is a real fight. There's also an attempt on Jersey. Mm-hmm. I think, though, I'm optimistic that people can see if we have enough of a fight back here, and there is quite a bit of argument against, which there wasn't in Canada originally. And there is a significant group of people who are actually making a difference, who are arguing against. And it tends to be the disabled groups, Not Dead Yet, for instance, who object that disabled people are being targeted for euthanasia in a way that other people aren't, and that they are being encouraged to suicide, whereas many other people aren't being encouraged to kill themselves. And other groups include the hospice movement. Probably about the medics are split 50-50, although when you get to hospice doctors, they're about 90% opposed. So you can see that there is real opposition, but it literally comes down to people speaking up about this issue that I think makes the difference in the UK, and perhaps did in 2015 when we had a very comprehensive vote on it. I don't think in England and Wales that is going to happen in the next little while, but there is a possibility in Scotland, and all our eyes will be on Scotland to see what people think there, mm-hmm. or what happens in the legislature, really.